This video is on question 17 of the 2012 TSA paper. And here we're asked which option, if true, most weakens the argument. And this is the passage that we're given. So we're first told that the cancer rate is higher in Europe than it is in developing countries outside of Europe. And according to the author, this difference in cancer rates cannot be due to genetic differences. And this is because Europeans who go to developing countries outside of Europe are more likely to get cancer, whereas those who come from the developing countries to Europe are more likely to get cancer. The author notes that there are major differences in diet between the developing countries and Europe, and says that therefore it's reasonable to conclude that the higher cancer rates in Europe are due to certain cancer-causing foods. So that's the passage that we're given. And what exactly are we dealing with? Well, we're first given a fact, and then given a rejection of a certain view, namely that the difference in cancer rates is due to genetics. The author then provides a reason for this rejection before providing a reason for their own view, which is that the higher rates in Europe are due to differences in diet. So let's try and break this passage down even more. So here we have our 5 boxes. So in the top left here we have the fact, and this fact is the problem or the issue that the writer is addressing. So we can regard this as background. What's the rest of the passage saying? Well, here the author is saying that it's not genetics which are the cause of this difference, and this is a reason for their view about what the cause is. And here the author is saying that there are major differences in diet, and this is also a reason for their view about what the cause is. And what is their view about what the cause is? Well, their view is that differences in diet are responsible for the difference in cancer rates. So the argument looks something like this. It's not genetics that are responsible for the difference in cancer. Rather, there are differences in diet between developing countries outside of Europe and Europeans, and this is what is responsible for the difference in cancer. So you may be able to notice a flaw in this reasoning. See if you can identify it. Well, there may be more than one flaw, but one which sticks out is that there may be other relevant differences. Just because there is a difference in diet and genetics is not responsible, it does not mean that this difference in diet is responsible. Perhaps there's another difference which is responsible for the difference in cancer rates between Europeans and developing countries or citizens of developing countries elsewhere. So this seems to be the flaw in the argument. And when we look at the options, which is what we're going to do now, we want to be on the lookout for an option which relates to this flaw. So perhaps one that identifies another relevant difference. So here we have 5 options, and here we have what we've proposed as the flaw of the argument. Now, in this type of question, it's not necessary to have a flaw in mind when you go to look at the options, but in cases where there is a flaw that's relatively obvious, there's no harm if you go into looking at the options with a flaw in mind, which is what we're doing here. So can you see an option which maybe identifies a relevant difference between Europeans and those living in developing countries outside of Europe that may cause cancer? Well, option C seems to identify a relevant difference, namely the difference in stress levels between Europeans and those outside of Europe in developing countries. So if C is true, then perhaps it is the difference in stress rather than the difference in diet which is responsible for the difference in cancer rates. So if C is true, it seems to weaken the argument quite a bit. But let's just check the other options. Option A says that diet isn't a major cause of cancer in developing countries. Well, if diet isn't a major cause of cancer in developing countries, then this is perhaps because those in developing countries eat less cancer-causing food, to use the words of the author. And perhaps diet is a major cause of cancer in European countries. And in that case, diet would be the cause of the difference, and our author would be correct. So it seems plausible that A actually strengthens the argument. It certainly doesn't weaken it. What about option B? Well, this says that cancer rates are lower in the south of Europe than in the north of Europe. Now, this is irrelevant if we don't know the difference in diet between the north and the south, and that's if there is a difference. We can't infer anything from this about whether the difference in cancer rates between non-European developing countries and European countries is due to difference in diet. Now looking at option D. Option D says that diet can cause many other health problems besides cancer. Well, if we look back at the passage, we'll recall that the author isn't interested with any health problem but cancer. And so the link between diet and other health problems isn't relevant to the argument. And that leaves E as the final option to dismiss. This says that people who migrate to Europe from developing countries tend to be young and healthy. Well, if this is the case, then perhaps it's not due to old age that migrants from developing countries outside of Europe who come to Europe are more likely to get cancer. And if it's not due to factors to do with old age, then it seems it might be more likely that diet is the important factor. That diet is what is making these migrants who come to Europe more likely to get cancer. In that case, the argument would be strengthened. So it looks like option C is the only one which weakens the argument, and therefore option C most weakens the argument and is correct.